All right, now we start to drill down, and we have, I think, the country's most knowledgeable person about the states and state developmental disabilities programs in the states, and that's Nancy Thaler, who's going to join us and is going to present on the state of conditions in the states and the directions that her programs are going to be taking. She's been a champion of the expansion of community services, facilitating the deinstitutionalization of people with DD in Pennsylvania before she came to Washington, and in developing oversight of state-operated Medicaid home and Medicaid home and community-based services waiver programs. And as the adult parent, the parent of an adult son with cognitive disability, she brings a lot of personal knowledge to her work as well. So we're really delighted to have Nancy here in Colorado, and we invite her now to come and address us on this topic.
Good morning, and it's great to be here. And I, too, would like to thank the Colemans. We don't have a lot of benefactors that sponsor development for people with developmental disabilities. And so we certainly, all of us who care about people who have sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, really thank you very much for your efforts here. And I think it's just the beginning. Technology is going to make a huge difference for people. Okay, what's happening in state DD agencies and what are we looking at for the future? A little repeat, I'm not going to talk a lot about the recession, but what I'm going to talk to you about is actually what I talk to all of the state agencies about over and over and over every time I go out to a state, which has been a lot lately. And ain't it awful? We've been talking about the big reset. The National Governors Association last February published a document called the Big Reset, meaning rethinking, resetting government's relationship to its citizens. I had slides that said the tectonic shifts, the tectonic plates are shifting. All of that's true. And what we're as an association trying to get our members to do is get ready for the future. But I always find that I have to talk about why the future's changing because, as they say, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. People go through the Kubler-Ross, it can't be true, arguing, depression, but we got to get to acceptance quick because we have to get ready for it. So there are three big problems, and the economic recession that we're in now is frankly not the biggest problem. It is a compounding problem, it's not the biggest problem. The bigger problems are the structural deficits and debts that the country is facing, which is combined with the problem of us baby boomers. This is a graph of not the recession, not the economy, but job losses. And the job losses in this recession, which looks a lot worse than the slides of the recessions compared to each other. And so deep, longer, more unemployed people, the most unemployed people for a year or longer since the Great Depression, the highest unemployment rate among young adults, lots and lots of indicators that this is pretty bad. And we're going to have a generation of people who enter the workforce unable to get their dream job or a good job. And the data and research shows that people who enter the workforce during a recession never make up the difference with their peers who entered the workforce not in a recession. We're going to have half a generation of adult men who are unemployed and unable to support their families. And while both sexes work, there is a psychological factor still in our culture about men not being able to get a job and support their family. And with that brings social problems. And in that big red line that goes down there are lots and lots of families with sons and daughters with developmental disabilities. This is one of David's slides showing, he's got lots of great slides, a whole other presentation he could do for you, but showing that we've had 23 states actually show an inflation-adjusted reduction in the support. So it's really affected, while the overall increase has been about 1.4% the last year, and 0.4% the year before that. We have many states that took out of their system state dollars. Now, the stimulus package, which did no good, actually in our state DD systems kept that drop from going below 1%. Okay, so the economic recession is a problem. It's creating problems in other budget shortage. This is the real problem, and it's the structural deficit in the federal budget. This has a picture of projecting out to 2050. You can see what's gobbling up the budget, Medicare and Medicaid. And in that is the baby boom generation. And it's a compounded problem because many of the baby boomers, when they become Medicare eligible, also can become Medicaid eligible when their incomes drop. So they're in, and many people with developmental disabilities. In fact, some of our states speculate that up to 40 or 50% of the people they're serving are actually in both Medicare and Medicaid. And so then the other big expenditure you can see is interest, with a flat line for revenues projected. But at any rate, this is the undeniable fact that Medicare and Medicaid are a structural problem and not an easy one to solve. It matters what happens with Medicaid because our developmental disability systems are Medicaid systems. There isn't much anything else but Medicaid. So here are two pies using David's data. The slide on the left shows state and federal funds in the program. The slide on the right reshapes that. The 86% includes the state and federal funds that together fund the Medicaid program, because remember, the state government has to put up state match for the federal dollars. So 86% of the program is a Medicaid program. So what happens with Medicaid, you know, when they sneeze in Washington, we get pneumonia in the states. And so the third problem that's actually feeding into the structural problem is the demographic shift, the aging of the baby boom generation, which this chart, and I always say this is the NASD's logo, because when our members saw this, it was really, really sobering, and they need to remember it. The pink line going up is the trajectory of individuals 65 and older between now and 2030, and the blue line going practically flat to the right are working age females 25 to 44, the bulk of our workforce. And what you can see is one line's flat and one line grows. So, and you might say, well, just because they're 65 or older doesn't mean they're all going to need direct support staff in Medicaid. No, but they're going to take their daughters out of the workforce or their granddaughters out of the workforce. They're going to have money, and they're going to hire people on their own to do their laundry and cut their grass. As we get older, we start relying on people who are younger to help, and so they're going to draw people out of the workforce, and or those systems that support people in Medicaid are going to be competing. So what this picture says is that if you had all the money in the world, the workforce isn't there to hire. So the reality that our states have to confront is this, that there are structural problems in the federal budget which is going to result in some dramatic changes to Medicaid. And by the way, the issue of block grants, that will play out at the state level. If block granting happens and it's all down at the state level, was it Arkansas or Alabama legislator who said we cut everybody who didn't have a lobbyist? Well, the hospital industry and the pharmaceutical industry and the nursing home industry have big lobbyists. Families with home and community services do not, and that's where the battle will be fought. So we have growing budget deficits, a workforce shortage, believe it or not, and we still have people on the waiting list, so what's a state to do? Focus on sustainability, meaning what can we and future generations afford, and where is the best value? We've built systems never thinking about the future. As one of the people in this country who built the home and community-based system, in my case in the state of Pennsylvania, we didn't think about where we were going. We kept promising everybody a group home bed without really thinking that through. So here's a picture of what it costs. This is a picture that shows the average cost per person from a study Charlie Lakin did in a handful of states. Average ICFMR cost, non-family home and community-based services, which is group home. Host family, meaning not with your family, but living with somebody else where you don't pay for 24-hour paid supports, or with your own family. And this is a no-brainer. If you're a legislative budget committee or you're a governor's budget director, this is a no-brainer. And so the last column shows what could you do with $5 million? Well, a lot if you're supporting people living with their families, not so much if you're going to fund an ICFMR bed. But lately, since I've been hanging out with a lot of people in the aging system, I started thinking about when I hear them say the average length of stay of someone when they go into a nursing home on Medicaid is 18 to 24 months, I realize, wow, they don't do long-term care. We do long-term care. Because when people enter our system, they stay for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, a long time. And so I thought, well, let's cost that out. So you make a decision that someone goes into an ICFMR on day one, over 20 years, the cost is over $2.5 million. But you make a decision to support a family, and you maintain that over 20 years, okay, I didn't count for inflation here, the cost is $500,000. So multiply that by 30 years and 40 years. And so these decisions we make, or the nudging we do, the steering we do, has huge financial implications. I remember the decades when we steered people on the waiting list into group homes. Our states did not offer services to families in their home. They offered only out-of-home services, and so we built an expensive system. So what are our states concluding, or what should they conclude? It's that sustainability depends on how well we support families and, by the way, get people a job. So my friend at HSRI, John Augusta, created this slide that I kind of like a lot and have adapted. What states have to do is nudge their systems down a glide path away from what is most expensive to what is least expensive, or I like to say nudge the system to a system that's more person-centered, that supports families and involves people in their community, because it's true that those services that do that happen also to be the least costly. The trend has already begun. This is also Charlie Lakin's data. It shows over the last couple of decades that the people that we serve, and we serve about 1 million people of the 4.5 or 5 million who might be eligible, we serve about 1 million people, and every year it seems that more and more the people we serve, we're doing it by living with their families, and there's a reason for that. It started here in Colorado. Your state director in the early 90s, Charlie Allenson, had this idea in his head. He couldn't serve everybody on the waiting list with a group home, so he thought, I'll give everybody something. And he invented the idea that you could take a Medicaid waiver, call it a support waiver, and cap it per person. And he capped it at $5,000 a person. He came to a NASD's meeting. We all heard him, and lots of us went home and did exactly the same thing, because we knew we couldn't provide a bed to everybody, but we could afford some in-home services, or in his case, he said, a day program. So what happened over time? Initially, these support waivers were designed so that people could have something while they were waiting for the big waiver, the residential waiver. But the economy started to restrict and constrict, and the waiting list grew, and so states began growing their in-home waivers, but not growing their comprehensive waivers. And so people, more and more and more people were moving into these in-home support waivers. And so what we see now is close to 60%, but I have a little box on the side. There are some states where the percentage of people in services is over 70%, and you see them here. Arizona is really at about 90%. And so most of the people they serve are living with their families. And what does this say? What does this data say? It says that we're not a system of residential services. We are and are rapidly becoming a system where the core focus is people are living with their families. And I would suggest to you that the demographics and the budget realities, structural budget realities that we're looking at means that that will be the trend. we will not be able to expand residential services at the pace that people are coming at us on the waiting list, and we're going to have to find a way to support people who are living with their families, and I'll talk about that a little at the end. I just want to throw a thing in here. I cannot talk about the future without talking about jobs. This is a picture of the range in employment among people with developmental disability across states, and the question is, if Washington State can hit the 80s, why can't everybody else, or Oklahoma in the 60s? And our organization is beginning to address that. We've got a big project with states who are trying to figure out how to get on that same glide path. Okay, so what should we be doing for people? And I think this has immediate ramifications to technology, because if you think the future of technology is framed in the residential arrangement, think again. Most people are living with their families or family-like arrangements, and so taking technology to them is going to be a lot different than taking technology to a group home. So this is all built on the work of Shelley Reynolds out of the University of Missouri, whom we've been working with and like her thinking a lot. She says we got to chart a new way to think about supporting families. On the left is the old way. We thought about the parent. We got to think about family much bigger. Families are extended. There are siblings. There are sibling networks. There are siblings who are the primary caregivers these days. That we focus not just on the family, but that we be clear that the purpose of supporting families is so that in the end, their son or daughter, brother or sister has a good life, and they have a good life too. We're not supporting families for the sake of supporting families, and we're not supporting families going to the bottom just so that we can avoid the cost of long-term care. Our goal, our focus, our mission has to be a good life. So Shelley says there are 3 domains of family support, and this was an aha for us, and so we are teaching it to our members. The one kind of family support is the kind that we do. It's fee-for-service, units of service stuff that we send in, drop down the chimney without talking to anybody, send in the front door. It's habilitation workers, personal assistance, employment, adaptive equipment. I put in red some things that that I think might have a direct connection, or our technology. We can fund just about any kind of technology with CMS Medicaid funding. You know, we don't have to talk to the feds about this. There are states, and some of the vendors and people here are presenting are in states where the state agencies are funding this. So the feds aren't the challenge. The challenge is the state Medicaid agency and the state DD agency getting it and understanding how to craft it and understanding that it's sustainable and it's a good value for the dollar. And it's not bells and whistles and an add-on. So we know how to provide services into the home. But Shelley says what's equally as important is emotional supports. And those, any of us in our life, if we faced a tragedy or a challenge, cancer, diabetes, some death in the family, the first thing we want to do, first or second thing we want to do, is be or talk to somebody else who has the same experience. What doctors did you use? What was your experience like? What happens after chemo? What did you find a good doctor for your child with autism? But it is very hard for families to network with each other, and it's very hard for self-advocates to network with each other. And so we treat emotional support like that's the job of the private sector. The ARC does that, that's volunteer. We don't put any public funds into this. When the truth is, and any really good managed care company will tell you, the managed care companies that fund things like yoga and meditation, because they know an investment in those kinds of things offsets a demand for services. And we have to understand that this is good value for the money. Funding the infrastructure for a volunteer parent-to-parent network has a huge payoff. Funding the infrastructure for self-advocacy, where people get a voice so they can speak for themselves and protect themselves, is a good investment. And the third is information and training and supports. Families, one of the things you always hear from families is they can't find information. And we think we're bombarding them with information. And we are, but not when they need it. And like all of us, families only pay attention to the information they need, information when they need it. Otherwise, they zone it out. So even though we think we're pumping it out all the time, we're not hitting the mark. And so what families are looking for is information. They want to know some really interesting things. I have another slide that I'm not going to use here today, but families want to know things like how to help their sons and daughters make friends, how to plan for the future financially, a lot of things that will help them sustain themselves, but we don't invest in that because that's not our job. But it is worth the investment. In regard to technology, the relevance here, I think, is that, and the downfall of technology is that we pay for the hardware, but not for the support and not the tech support and maintenance. And so all over this country, you'll find technology sitting on shelves all over the place because, oh, it was too complicated and I put it aside. Imagine in your organization, somebody puts a PC on your desk and you have no IT support. How long do you think you'd use it? 3 days. So, and there's a gal in Pennsylvania who was the USAID director who taught me, don't say technology without saying support services. And I think that's right, and also a fundable service. So rethinking our support to families, our state systems need to begin to think of it not as a sidebar little program called family support over here, but as the core mission. Because if we're going to have a sustainable system for the next 3 decades, families are the building unit. Think about families broadly, including people who are like family. That the purposes of the service is ultimately to benefit the family member. No time to go into it now, but there are lots of complications with people living with their families, just like there are lots of complications when they move out and live in a group home. But those complications are the families are very complex, and they're families, we hurt each other, we help each other, we sacrifice for each other, but those are the dynamics that we have to get involved in. We need to give families and individuals, if they're going to be the core here, then they need to have more control. Learning how to pay family caregivers, we've got about 48 states that are doing this already, paying family caregivers. And going back to Shelley Reynolds' slides, services are important, information and training are critical, and emotional supports hold it all together. And as systems, we need to look at all of those. Okay, does everybody have to live with their family to have a sustainable system? Because I often hear pushback from families who say, I want a life, and I was hoping my son or daughter would leave like her siblings. So there are 2 answers to this. And maybe the best way to answer it is, what we're looking for in sustainability is not proliferating services that require 24-hour around-the-clock staffing. That's the thing, whatever you call it. An ICF-MORA group home, some people call it supported living, but they're 24 hours. That's the thing that's unsustainable. So any arrangement that pulls away from 24-hour paid supports is what it will help us build a sustainable system. And so it could be living with friends, family, extended family, shared living, 2 people with a disability living together. And I think this is where technology comes in. Technology can relieve the cost of 24-hour services. And if we think about that, where we take our supports might be different places. People might live with a nuclear family, with siblings, with aunts and uncles, with cousins, shared living with people they know, either disabled or non-disabled. My son lives with a 70-year-old guy in Philadelphia. They're both Philly fanatic freaks and Eagles fans, and they get along great, and it's shared living. And Ralph opened his house to Aaron, and there are not paid 24-hour supports, and Aaron's got a great life. But the supports around Ralph are no different than the supports around mom and dad or sister and brother. And a job. I could do another extended chart showing 50 years in a sheltered workshop, or a big investment up front in employment and 50 years in the workforce. And we'll see a different trajectory regarding finances, but certainly outcomes as well. So the bottom line here is I'm not saying this should happen, that reliance on family is going to increase, because it ought to. We want it. It's going to happen because of the demographic and the economic realities of our country. And it's going to happen not only for people with disabilities, but for those of us that have aging parents. I don't know if you've been in a Medicaid-funded only nursing home lately. Not a place where you want to end up. And so unless you're independently wealthy and can afford $75,000 a year for a nursing home bed or $60,000 a year for a assisted living facility for if you live 10 and 20 years, the seniors in this country are going to be reliant on family members in some form or other. So it's not a question whether it's a societal shift. It's the big shift that's going to happen. So it's not a question of whether it's going to happen or not. It's a question of whether families will struggle alone or whether they're going to have a great life because the supports were there for them. That's it. Thank you.